Jay Burden, what a pleasure to have you here, and welcome to the Gauntlet.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Luke. It's funny. I feel like there are certain people who I like quite a bit, but I'm absolutely cursed when it comes to recording with. And for whatever reason, it seems like it never works out. Like, for instance, it doesn't
Yeah,
matter much because it is pre-recorded, but we had a time zone mix-up. So deeply sorry about that, but I'm glad to finally be talking
I
to you
think
again face to face.
the mix-up was both sides, so I'm also feeling bad for having got the time zones wrong. But we are the evidence is here. We finally managed to figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. We managed to sort it out somehow, right?
So, round one. Do you want to talk about music? Do you want to talk about economics? Or do you want to talk about cosmology?
We're gonna go with music.
Great. Here are your three assertions. Classical Western music theory is irrelevant. Choosing music is an ethical matter. Or globalization has hurt music. And
I'm gonna
remember, you
take
can argue for or against any of these.
I'm gonna take the tact that globalization has hurt music. I will take that. I will argue in the affirmative.
Great. Take it away.
All right. So my thought on that one is effectively, and this is sort of something you see in accents as well, is that globalization has a homogenizing factor, right? You see this in the sort of disparaging term global homo, right? That as something become globalized, it becomes the same. And this is actually something we have seen in American top 40 pop music, right? There was a time at which not only, and I'm not a huge pop music guy really from any era, but it would not be uncommon to see, there would be a jazz song, a rock and roll song, a straight pop song, something more jazzy in the top 40. And over time, we've seen not only the genres that are quote unquote permitted in the top 40, but also the complexity of those songs going down. There's a graph floating around on the internet that basically tracks how many key changes there are in songs in the top 40. And again, I'm not saying top 40 is, the best measure of music I like. It's just a convenient metric for the sake of this argument. And what you find is that in the 60s, well over half of songs had a key change in it, right? That's an element of musical complexity. And now, in the year of our Lord 2024, we're down to single digit percentages, right? Less than 5% of top 40 songs, which shows you objectively what we hear, which is popular music is becoming more dumbed down. Now, one of the other things, right, is that when something becomes more mass market, it can't have any one culture's values attached to that. So you see this in super big tentpole movies, right, like Marvel or Star Wars, that when these were properties connected to one culture, you could have a romance in it. You could have kind of definitive statements made about right and wrong. But once that movie has to play in China, India, America, Tel Aviv, everywhere, all of those cultural signifiers, like, oh, they're, you have to swing across the gap, grab the pretty girl, kiss her, and then run away. Well, there are some cultures where they don't want you to do that. So you have to peel that away. And now, while we've seen the de-sexing of movies, we have seen sort of the opposite in music, which is just like a lowest common denominator, like sexual tribal dance, which is, effectively the musical equivalent of like Peeps or like Cotton Candy, right? Where it is massive, like on the mass level palatable, because it is basically just like 4 on the floor dance beat and I like sex, which is something that almost anyone can kind of comprehend. And so I think what we've seen is not only the death of complexity, not only the death of genre into one kind of like mono fusion genre, but more importantly, we've seen the decline of local music and live music, right? Even in a relatively recent era, if you went to an event and there was music, it would be live music. It would be a small band from around your area, most likely playing songs that were popular in your area, written about people in your area. And so that was a cohesive cultural experience. Now you can go to a cafe in Paris, a pub in, I was going to say London, but I guess they don't have pubs in London anymore. A pub in England somewhere,
there are
basically.
pubs around in London. I've been to pubs in London recently.
I thought that the New Englanders didn't like alcohol. But point is,
Oh, I
or
see. Yes.
yeah, sorry, it was a look. I've been up for approximately 18 minutes. It was a poor attempt at a joke. Or a restaurant in Berlin, and you can effectively hear the same Ariana Grande song, right, playing
Yeah.
from a pre-recorded system. Whereas in a previous era, all of those places, if they had live music, it would be local musicians. So you also
Mm,
see the decline in basically the ability to be a sort of working musician. Now in order to
mm,
be a working musician, you can't just be, a guy from your small town who, owns a violin and is pretty decent and knows all the songs. And so he can pick up some cash on the weekends. You have to be either a touring musician, a classical musician working for a church or some sort of organization. And that requires a lot more skill from a certain perspective, right? You have to devote your life to being a musician. Whereas if
mm,
all of your competition is the 100 people in your village, right? You can probably, have a fun job on the weekends, playing at festivals. This was relatively normal. And so maybe from an objective level, you could say there are more people who have a higher level of objective technical skill. That might
mm,
be true. Now, that said, if that correlated to ever better and ever better music, certainly, in the era of a music college in every town, we would expect that there would be 10 Wagners, or 3 Bachs running around. That has not happened. Far from it. And so to me, I think it's manifestly clear that globalization has hurt music uh, for the reason of homogenization, for the reason of deterritorialization, and also we can look at the receipts here and very clearly, this is not a high culture ascending to ever greater levels. It is basically, I like women, I like car, and a four on the floor dance beat in the background.
Have you ever considered becoming a top 40 pop artist? Because with some of these song suggestions you're coming up with, these are fire.
Yeah, I
I
think
I like
I
women,
could
I
be.
like cars, and I like sex would be a fantastic opening album to sort of
Well, thank you. Well,
launch your
thanks.
career.
Well, thanks to all of these AI audio editing programs that are coming out soon. I may be. You may never know. I may become like one of these VTubers who creates a completely alternate persona, or I just kind of like stitch some anime girl over my face, but it'll be me in the background. Sort of commanding this from the back. I like that idea. I'll see. I'll see if it works.
Well, I actually found a website that does AI songs the other day. So I'll tell you what, in the background, while we're talking, I'll see if I can generate "I Like Women" as the top 40 pop song, and we'll listen to it later in the stream. But
Yeah,
what
I mean,
is the difference between, you mentioned movies having gone in a very safe direction where they've taken out anything sexual from a lot of films. It's all got to be PG-13 because it's got to appeal to a global audience. So yes, I see the argument there. But then music, you're saying, is different, and that's gone in like a hypersexual direction in the top 40, where I can't imagine if I had children under 12 that I'd want to just put a radio station that was playing top 40 music on. I don't, it would probably not be appropriate. So how come these two things have gone in different directions as a result of globalization?
so one, I think, is the fact that film is a visual media, and generally it is easier to control visual media. You're like, all right, no XYZ body parts in our film, or no kissing or something like that. Where it's like a lot of in music, right? A lot of, with notable exceptions, right? A lot of music, it can sort of be unstated innuendo. And one of the other things, let's be honest, is that there will often be, a sort of an album version and a radio version of a song, right? That still goes on, and so like oh like there's this old CeeLo Green song. It's a stupid song from like 2007 or whatever, some R&B song. And forgive my French, but the original album title of the song is "Fuck You," and it's basically him telling that to a girl like 35 times. It's not a particularly artfully done song, but on the radio, that's "Forget You," and that becomes a
Mm,
hit. And so a lot of
Mm.
people didn't even know that the original version is like this kind of like, low-minded, basically just like, 4-letter insult for 4 paragraphs, right? And so that's part of it. I think another part of it also is the cultures that are amplified in movie and music tend to be rather different. Like we've seen like there are certain things like obviously like kind of like American crime culture is really big in music. That's a different effect than there aren't a lot of like pushers from the block who are being given the helm of a $350 million music project. So that's part of it. Now, don't get me wrong. There is also this whole level of like bubblegum pop music, that has absolutely no content whatsoever. It's just about kind of like summer love. You think of the music, that the Proles sing in 1984, right? That has absolutely no content whatsoever. It's just written by machines. That exists and is real. Now, I'm also hampered in this discussion by believing this assertion so much that I have not interacted with the top 40 in roughly 5 to 10 years and have no plans to change that. When it comes to specifics, I can give you specifics that are sort of 5 to 10 years out of date. Actually, if we're thinking about this, like the example is someone like Taylor Swift, right, who is incredibly popular the world over. And I mean, I can't really think of any of her songs that are, by the kind of Hays Code definition in any way objectionable. If we could dig into the ideology contained in them and find things we don't like, of course, their assumptions, their priors are all garbage. But, she's not, at least in my mind, from what I know, and I've lived around young women before, I can't remember anything where she has, both middle fingers up. So I think that
Mm.
there's part of that is just like the explosion of rap music, which has that, kind of contained in it. And then also this sort of like, and this is sort of faded in the post-Trump era, but the nasty woman effect, which was
Mhm.
basically like, oh, I'm going to be super vulgar and super aggressive. And so there's a Beyonce song, Sorry, right? And it's worth your time to look up the music video because it is so, or the live recording of it because it's so incredibly cringe. This was like during the height of Me Too, the height of the post-Trump stuff. And the song starts off, and she literally is calling and responding to a massive crowd of women. And she's like, "Are you strong?" And they were like, "Woo, yes, we're strong." Are you fierce? Yeah, like just like that, which is so embarrassing. It's so patronizing. And then the first line of the song is middle finger up, and then they just proceed to just like go into just tearing men apart and screaming profanity at them. And so that's part of it. There's sort of both of those things at once. And I think in movies, the other thing about movies is movies have, like, at least mass budget movies, have gotten so phenomenally expensive that they sort of can't afford to risk it not doing well in any one audience. Where it's like, okay, well, Iran will never listen to Lady Gaga. That's fine. We'll make enough money elsewhere because it doesn't cost us $1 billion to produce a new Lady Gaga album. Just off the top of my head, I realize she's sort of out, but that's I think my response to that, if that makes sense.
Last question before I play you my brand new pop banger that I've cooked up here. Do you think that we have the perception of the music that people are listening to from the top 40 because the top 40 proclaims itself as the music of the masses, and in reality people are all listening to very niche genres. They've got their unique Spotify playlists. They're listening to whatever random song that someone sends them a link to on YouTube. The number of people listening to top 40 has plummeted dramatically, right? And it's a bit like I was trying to think of an analogy that the type of food that people eat these days is, I'd argue, more varied than it was prior to globalization, in that there are an Indian restaurant, Chinese restaurant, a Thai restaurant, Italian food. People will eat a wider variety of food, but if you go to a wedding where you have to you have one caterer who has to make something that pleases everybody, you're more likely to get a pretty straight down the line meal that's more bland, but it's less interesting, but also less likely to offend people. So assessing the food that people eat via wedding breakfast menus would be equivalent to assessing the music that people listen to via top 40. It's actually the unusual instance where people are listening. You probably, if you go into a shop, you'll be exposed to random music, but most of the time these days people are actually listening to very bespoke playlists.
So you're 100% right in that. And so there are two things there. One, what you're talking about has really been propelled by the development of algorithms, right? That once you have not just a playlist, right, but a playlist curated to you, you see exactly what you're talking about, right? The explosion of, micro genres. One of the interesting things in this actually is that the top 40 has been more and more female dominated. Like generally men do not listen to pop music in that way. And so, you sort of see, more and more female artists, more and more artists catering to women. So one of the other things from that is I believe that goes directly into my thesis, right? Which is when your music taste is not in any way connected to the culture you're a part of, who you're around, but it is something algorithmically selected for you. It's the exact same thing we see with all these bizarre micro internet communities, where you have people who are, have a lot of karma on Reddit, are very, very popular in, the online furry community, but can't go outside. And so there's sort of a similar problem with music, right? Where it's like, well, you and the 10 other people on your block, none of them have music in common. None of those artists have anything in common with where you live. It's become completely and totally de-atomized. And so if you're, someone who is like, oh, well, my purpose in life is to only listen to death metal music. Well, guess what? This is great for you, because you have access to more death metal, better death metal from all over the world at the push of a button. But as someone who's primarily interested in having a good culture, right? Having a culture in which one where people have things in common and they can work towards common goals, we have a common sense of ethics. I don't see that as a good thing whatsoever. And so, the development of the algorithm, and you see this very much in Gen Z, right, has pushed people into being fundamentally incompatible with each other because their cultures are so completely different, even though they live, within 100 yards of each other.
All right. Are you ready to hear? I've just cooked up this song. It's entirely AI. I actually do make music, including sort of pop style music. So this is an example of AI, encroaching right on my turf. So this will be interesting. But I'll give you the rights to this song. If you want to release it under your name. I don't know if it'll suit your brand. They've got the auto-tuned vocal there, haven't they?
Oh yeah.
Got women on my mind and cars beneath me. In the fast lane, feeling the adrenaline. Got a need for speed. Gotta let it all in. Feeling the attraction, the energy so high.
Isn't it crazy that this is possible with
Oh yeah, it's also, I mean, don't get me wrong, it clearly sounds a little off, but it's not that off.
By the way, I don't know how loud that was. Hopefully that was coming through okay.
Oh no, it was loud enough. And Your Honor, I rest my case.
I'd argue that's probably better than most of what's in the top 40.
Yeah, I know. Well, I was waiting. I was anticipating some really ribald reference to sex, and to give the AI credit, it classed it up.
It did. I was also impressed by that. I hesitated putting in "I like sex" into the prompt because I didn't know what it was going to do. But I wonder if they, I wonder if when they were training the algorithm, they actually steered it away from.
Almost undoubtedly. At least I hope so. Right?
Yeah. So props to, as much as we fear the AI, at least in this case, they made a moral decision, I would argue. I need to give you a score. Right. How about I'm going to give you 12 for round one.
I appreciate it.
That's a good score. Round two, ethics, history, or metaphysics?
Oh, let's do ethics.
Okay. Ethics is fundamentally relational. Euthanasia is never the answer. Or animals deserve the same ethical considerations as humans.
I will take animals deserve the same ethical considerations as humans.
All right. And are you arguing for or against?
Oh, fundamentally against.
Okay. Go for it.
For sure. When we consider this proposition that animals deserve the same ethical considerations as humans, there's sort of several things buried into that, right? So, Luke, you and I are both people of faith. I'll take that argument first and then move past it, not because I consider it in any way unimportant, but it won't be as relevant to everyone. So one, if we just look at the source text here, God very clearly puts us over top of animals, right? Literally in dominion. So does that mean, right, that you can sort of adopt this exterminationist model? We will get rid of animals. By no means. That's sort of gross, But within that, there is a rank ordering. Your responsibilities are, first and foremost to God. Then there's this sort of like chain of responsibilities. And very, very clearly, humans are placed over top of that. We see that by over and over and over again. Animals are sacrificed on behalf of humans, quite literally. Right. Abraham cuts in half, any number of farm animals, walks through the middle. And, while the Old Testament has a relatively high body count, it would be a very, very different document if he was like, hey, you and you come here. I need some guts, and just, split right through the middle of them. So that's the scriptural element, right? We are very clearly placed over top of animals, right? And to move it into more of a secular zone, there's this really horrible creeping idea of equality, which is basically X is the same thing as Y. And this is something that, people before our time were really not afflicted with. And, animals deserve the same considerations as humans is sort of the nth degree of that in a certain sense, which is, all living things are the same because, and the most common example you hear is they can feel pain, right? We shouldn't increase the amount of pain. And to be honest, basing your entire society off the premise of care harm, right, which is the minimal amount of pain for all beings ever. I mean, that sounds nice, but it's sort of a society that doesn't work, right? That there needs to be an in-group and out-group to society, right? Things you consider, things you don't. And when we're dealing with society, obviously, just like the same chain of obligation to God, we have a chain of how that is considered. Right. So, for instance, your family, you have to make decisions that benefit your family at the expense of other people around you. Right. That is the purpose of having a family. They're a higher moral weight. So let's take that one kind of like consideration up the ladder, which is your city. Right. You would be very, very upset if your mayor was making decisions that were horrible for your city, but benefited the city next door. Right. We understand this on a political level. And one of the reasons so many people are angry at our national level politicians is that they are making decisions for refugees from other countries who maybe not have even shown up yet at the expense of people who are part of the in-group of their society, right? People who have been a part of that for hundreds and or thousands of years. And so we understand this concept that there's a ordering to moral goods. Right, that it can both be true that you shouldn't be unnecessarily mean to strangers, and also given the choice of hey, I can either do something, I can give this medicine to my daughter, or to some random stranger, it would be a monstrous act to give it to someone you've never met, right? There is a ordering of your responsibilities. And
Mm.
if we look at, well, okay, like, does that produce bad societies, right? That's the proof is in the pudding here. I would argue not. You know, in an era in which we understood that rank ordering, we lived in better societies. You know, we look at communism, which is not the same thing as, you know, animals deserve the same considerations as human, but it is fundamentally an idea to reorder that value system, right? To in the direction of equality, and far from creating this kind of ethical humanist, you know, masterpiece of a society, it's massively bloody and dysfunctional. It just doesn't work. And so we look at the relationship between animals and humans. The problem is, one, we live in conditions of scarcity, right? There is simply not enough. And in certain situations, the interests of animals and humans writ large, I think those terms are almost too broad to really talk about, are not, they're not aligned, right? It is something like, okay, well, you know, wolves want to have, you know, hundreds of square miles of, you know, essentially untouched country, and they want to be able to attack, you know, any large herbivore in that area. And, you know, if you're a cattle farmer, that's a problem for you, right? You need fences for your cattle. You know, you need your calves not to get eaten. And so, well, who do we decide with there, right? Do we decide that, oh, the farmer who has a family and has bills to pay and contributes food to the local economy? Well, there are more wolves involved, right? There are 30 wolves and one of him. So we put them on the scale and determine that, oh, the harm caused by making those wolves sad is worse than making that farmer sad. And it's an absurd situation, of course, right? But it comes down to that premise of, like, what are we making this judgment on? So also it becomes very difficult to, where do we divide the line for what counts as animals, right? Do we mean apes, right? Relatively intelligent primates, or whales, right? Who can sort of reason their way around things. Okay, like we could probably make steps in society to make those kind of large animals that you can make stuffed animals out of more happy. Okay. But where do we draw the line there, right? Because there are a lot of animals that aren't particularly cute. You know,
I've seen stuffed animals of amoeba.
well, true, right? But I mean, that's a great example. It's like, okay, you have a parasite living in your body. Well, that animal doesn't have the same moral consideration as you. I realize this is probably reminding people of the violinist argument against abortion, or in favor of abortion, although in this case, we are fundamentally not dealing with two people of the same moral weight. We are dealing with, you know, your grandma and a tapeworm. And, well, if these are just two lives, you know, who are you to say the difference between one and the other? But if we understand that there's a ranked order, right, that not only is there an ordering within that broad category of animals, let's be honest, there's a rank ordering within that broad category of humans. But when those two things come into contact, sorry, the tapeworm's got to go, right? And again, this is a basic building block of civilization that we understood before very recently. And I think that, you know, when you see these sort of radical animal equality advocates, it's sort of a self-refuting premise just by way of how these people look and how they live. You know, where it's like, you look like a mentally unwell, crazy person. I don't want to let you have control of society. And when you look at people who understood, right, that, like, okay, well, you know, animals should not be necessarily treated cruelly, but you can't run your entire society about along the lines of making it more pleasant for animals, or else nothing will get done, right? You won't be able to eat a healthy diet. You know, we use animal products in quite a number of things aside from food. You know, all of those things will fall down will fall down. To me, that is a very easy decision to be made. The food thing is probably best saved for people who have a more scientific mind than I do. But I'll put it this way: if you don't want to harm animals, it's very, very difficult to either obviously eat animal products, but also to do any sort of farming at scale whatsoever, right? Tilling the ground destroys animal life. Having agriculture at all harms animals. And so once you've entered the level of, well, we're just splitting hairs here, making things better or worse for animals, it's like, well, okay, you've sort of seeded the premise to begin with. And I find this assertion largely a complete and total waste of time for serious people to discuss. Not in, obviously, look at the context we are, but if someone actually says this, they're retarded and you shouldn't listen.
Yeah, I agree that the idea that animals should have the same ethical consideration as humans, as stated, is a pretty flimsy. Well, it's pretty much a nonsense statement. You might find a 4-year-old who can't figure out the problems with it. But yeah, I've given you an easy task to knock this down. Let me sharpen the question a little bit, though. Is there a number of animals of some species which you could contemplate that the sum total of the lives of those animals would be of greater importance than the life of one human? Or would you be theoretically prepared to destroy all life in a vast portion of the rainforest, let's say, to save one human life?
Well, sure, right, and this is kind of the difference between ethics and the real world, right? Is that we have had a great number of people, actually, it would be impossible to tabulate, who have been killed to protect animals, right? So currently, the UK and France are sort of in a not hot but kind of weird conflict over fishing rights, right? And people have been killed; they've been swept overboard and drowned. And so you could say, well, that's stupid. Why would you sacrifice a human life for, I don't know, 300 mackerel or something like that? And it's like, well, that's not really the decision being made, right? You don't have a scale like with Thoth, right? With one human soul on one side and X number of mackerel on the other. Because again, we understand that, animals are below humans. And so animals can sort of become a resource at a certain point. So you're not really like weighing up someone's cat against someone's grandma. It is, well, okay, like, does society value access to this resource, right? And that could even be, a national park or something that is, valuable in a more like spiritual or sort of like, like non-material way. That is something I think that's pretty normal to have happen. Even, right, you could have, an animal that is considered sacred, right? Like our Indian brothers and sisters who quite like the cow. And if you, kill or maim a cow, you can be expected to meet mob justice, right? Okay, I can look at that and say that's a little bit silly. I sort of don't understand Indian culture from any angle. But nonetheless, right, is that really about the destruction of one cow? I mean, kind of, yes, but really that is an attack against culture. You're basically like attacking a religion or attacking something else. And so again, right, I think in all of those situations, it's not, technically you are deciding that an animal is more valuable than a human, but in effect, it is something about something bigger. You are not deciding between, on this kind of like trolley problem level. This is again, a world of scarcity, and there are competing moral goods. And sometimes that good is, well, we have a fishery that's vital to our economy, and we're going to have to send out a gunboat and blow up, a small group of pirates or something, and that's not necessarily because we want to, protect XYZ number of fish, but it is, these animals can become more than merely just, a pet you keep effectively.
Well, in the case of the fishing disputes, then I think our real interest is in eating the fish rather than the pleasant lives of the fish is the reason that we're fighting.
Well, right. And again, that also accepts that premise that animals and humans do not have the same ethical consideration, right? It's just weighing a different sort of ethical consideration.
But I can imagine there would be situations where somebody might put their own life in risk. Oh, well, I've just thought of a really interesting reference to bring in here. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep, Jesus says. Now, obviously, he's talking about himself laying down his life for us, for the people who, are under him. He's the great shepherd to Christians. But he has, in passing, referenced a responsibility that that shepherds have, and I guess the particular implication of that in the ancient Near East would have been the flock are the property that either the shepherd owns or the shepherd has quite likely been hired on behalf of somebody who owns the flock, and so what you've really got there is somebody who's been hired as a bodyguard, and the bodyguard is expected to put his life on the line to protect the property of the owner. But nonetheless, we therefore see that human life, in an instance of military engagement or some other kind of security, it's acceptable to weigh it, as a resource to be used in the protection of other things, which is different from, I think, a lot of the time, we more religious, conservative leaning people, when we're talking about things like abortion, quite rightly, are holding up human life as the highest, most sacred, precious resource that must be protected under all circumstances. But I think it is right to acknowledge that also your life is something that you can choose to lay down for things that matter. And we're in a very protected situation where we tend to, we go crazy because we've been kept waiting for 5 minutes by a bureaucratic system. We are so far from thinking about laying down our lives for anything. But I think if we were more in the sharp end of existence, we'd have to. These trolley problem type of situations, which seem so abstract, would become very real. Where you say, when do I risk my life? Under what situations is it right to run? And I think, having grown up so soft and protected as I have in 21st century superpower, I probably have instincts that are overly cowardly as a man. And actually, if there were animals that were somebody's property and I'd been hired as a security guard, according to Jesus, it would be right for me to exchange my life to protect those animals. So what do you say to that?
Again, you're 100% right, but we see the view of animals as becoming sort of something different than an animal in that case, right? We're not necessarily, the Good Shepherd does not protect just for the sake of being nice to animals, right? The Good Shepherd is not out there, trying to find wild goats and different and other animals
as well.
Yeah. That might be vulnerable to the hypothetical lion, right? it is a defined in-group and out-group, right? So that I think is something to be considered. As far as your point about cowardice, that's 100% true, right? That I think another reason that this is even floated is that we are sort of removed enough from material scarcity that you don't really have to yourself make any gross decision. So for instance, right, in a world, where it was very common that 90% of people, 93, I believe, was the pre-industrial revolution, British stat, worked in agriculture, right, in some way. It's like, well, you don't really have the option to hold that belief. You don't really get to take the luxury of deciding, well, I don't want to be, what is vaguely defined as mean to animals. Because it's like, well, okay, you're going to die if you don't have an ox to pull your plow. You're going to die if you don't have, a hog to slaughter, and something like that. And so I think that your broader point is completely and totally correct. And, to address your point about the Good Shepherd, within that, again, right, we see a defined in-group, out-group. And that would be a very different discussion, right? If you were a guard over 30 people, right? If you're the guard at the city gates, the question of you running away, it becomes a completely different order of magnitude, right? If you're a shepherd who runs away and then a sheep gets eaten, you'll probably get fired from your job and you won't be able to work as a shepherd again. But if you're the guard at the city gate and you run away and, the enemy comes in and either steals something or kills a bunch of people, while you certainly are no longer working as a guard, I mean, we don't need to go too far back in history to learn the type of punishments that were given to traitors and to soldiers who fell asleep on watch, even if it wasn't conscious, for the very reason that if that resulted in the death of human life or the destruction of a village or whatever, it was the most serious crime. So again, I think even built into that, we see a definite sort of rank order between human and animal life.
Good. Well, I'm going to give you 13 points for that because excellently argued and very clear and thought through, and I would expect nothing less. Cinema and theatre, world affairs, or epistemology?
Cinema and theater.
Entertainment is the primary utility of cinema. Casting should reflect demographic realities, or music is the most important element in a film.
I am going to argue against entertainment is the primary utility of cinema.
So what is the primary utility of cinema?
I think that, there, as with anything else, right? Any sort of medium, we have to realize that there's a pyramid to everything, right? And in much the same way, if we ordered people on height or, how much money they earn, how good they are at any one skill, we would see a pyramid, right? Or a normal distribution. There are quite a lot of people who are fine at it. There are some people who are quite bad at it. And there's a very few people who are what we consider auteurs. And cinema is very much the same thing. I think that we are past the point of arguing that cinema is an art form. I would assert that there is enough points on the board for cinema as art that we can kind of check that off as an issue, right? It has been decided that this is a real art form. And so now the question becomes, what is the purpose of art? And I think that looking at art as primarily a way to entertain yourself is a pretty low-minded way to look at it, right? Now, that doesn't mean in the case of created images that most created images are not designed, for instance, to sell you something. But does that mean that the point of the visual art is to sell you something? Not at all, right? It is sort of a debased version of this ideal. Similarly, I'd argue with cinema, right? The purpose of art is, sort of to transcend reality. So you take an example like Stalker, right? A Tarkovsky film that I quite like. Is that film entertaining? I mean, I find it entertaining. I get a lot out of it. But, if you're not paying attention to the dialogue, for instance, like that's a very boring film. Whereas there are a lot of films that, the dialogue adds to it, it can get you a chuckle, but like even a film that I like and think has some artistic merit, but like something like Drive, like that's an action movie. I can watch that without the sound on and it won't be the same, but I can kind of get the point. Like, okay, he hits the dude with a hammer. That activates my monkey brain. He drives a car. I like driving a car, much like that song we heard earlier. And so, we see that sort of, entertainment level is very much not being necessary to the ultimate expression of the art, right? But that transcendent idea, right, that we are talking about something, we are sort of taking you to a place you could not without this like weird combination of like, visual and audio cues all working together. I think that is, like many other forms of art, like the ultimate utility, the ultimate purpose of it. And again, I'm not denying that most cinema is produced to be entertaining, but what's the most of something is produced to do, I mean, that can't really be said to be its purpose. Like if we're looking at, like guns, for example, right? The purpose of a gun is to shoot, to kill someone. Most guns are not produced to do that, right? In the US, most of them are produced to be stashed under the bed to make you feel good, right? But the idea that the purpose of a gun is to make you feel good, that falls apart very clearly. What? And so to me, I think that once we look at that premise of like, well, what is the highest form of a thing, right? The ideal of it designed for, that is its purpose as a genre, as a sort of like thread of human thought. To me, when we look at sort of art film, right? I watched, even The Seventh Seal relatively recently with my wife. And is that movie entertaining? To modern audiences, no. It's sort of awkward and weird, but there's an immense amount of artistic merit to it, right? It is a discussion on death and faith, right? Can I ever be sure of the existence of God when I've never seen him? How do I reconcile my faith with human suffering? And it's visually very well done. It's shot very well. And so even if you are someone who kind of fundamentally disagrees with the argument of that piece, there's a lot to think about there. You were sort of being transported into someone else's brain, understanding how they view the world. and also sort of being treated to, you know, a discussion about something that's quite edifying and complicated, and also getting the benefits of visual art, right? You were seeing these sort of images that provoke, you know, deeper thought. And so it's like, again, right? Like, was I paying attention? Was I in rapt attention through the whole film? Yes. Is that the same thing as being entertained in the same way that you'd be entertained by, you know, a 3-minute music video, you know, or a TikTok or something? It's like, well, maybe, you know, I think that those are in different categories. I don't know if entertainment is quite the same thing. And within this, you see the idea of taste, right? Developing taste. I was talking to Athenian Stranger about this in the context of education, right? That there are a lot of great things that are not immediately sort of appealing to you in your base state, right? You cannot sit down someone who is 7 or 8 years old, you know, hand them Shakespeare, and they'll just be, you know, devouring it at the fastest pace they can. I mean, there are certainly some who do that. That's a distinct.
Yes, my sister might be the exception here, but yes, I take your point.
Well, I'll put it this way. I've never met someone who's like that. And so we have Luke's sister. So 1 point against me, and I'll go with every other person I've met in my category and make a generalization, right? But nonetheless, this is the idea that you can have your taste trained towards higher things, away from, you know, the kind of like simple, sweet cotton candy of, you know, Marvel movies, or, you know, whatever newest kind of like global homo slop has been put out, and towards something that actually requires, something of you past your passive participation, past just sitting there slack-jawed, you know, watching the CGI monster fight. And so to me, I see that as sort of the end goal, the purpose, if you will, of cinema, right? It's sort of related to that of any other art form. And given that cinema is an art form, I feel very comfortable making that claim.
I want to make a food analogy here, in that I think entertainment could be likened nutritionally to something like fat or sugar or something in a dish. And if all that you eat is 100% salt, fat, sugar, delicious, hyperpalatable food, you're going to be lacking the vitamins and minerals that you need, and you're going to be overdosing on something that's actually quite bad for you. However, you can go too far the other way, where you're eating needlessly bland food that is unappetizing, unenjoyable. From a Christian perspective, you're actually missing the opportunity to enjoy the good things that God has given you. And you can, if you enjoy your life, you should turn that back into worship. But to go back to the films and cross the bridge back from my analogy here, if you think about your input as a consumer, as a recipient of art, as you were talking about, I think you have a responsibility to yourself, and maybe if you're a parent, you have a responsibility to think about the artistic nutritional input that you're providing for your children, in that the higher minded philosophical aspects of art that build you as a person, and that give you a higher level of experience, are like the vitamins and the minerals and the things that our body needs but doesn't necessarily steer towards, but that over time are really important for our proper health and development. But at the same time, having a movie that is just purely art and carries no entertainment value is quite difficult to swallow. And I don't think there's anything wrong with a balanced, a good chef will present you with a meal that is both delicious and nutritious. And I think a good movie likewise needs, I would argue that the best movie would have both something important to say and will leave you resonating in some deep way with the artistic statement, whilst also being easy to digest. It's got that entertainment factor, like the spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down.
I think that's a good point. I think that there is no need to sort of, and I think the food analogy is apt, right? Because let's use sugar for example, right? The sort of sweetness pulls you into certain dishes, right? Especially like a complex, right? I think of something like caramelized onions, right? Where it's like that's sweet, that sort of pulls you into a dish in a very complicated, interesting way.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at the same time, right, if you go down to your local, service center, you go down to your gas station, almost everything there has a lot of sugar in it. And it's so much sugar that it'll probably make you into a gross fat weirdo, right? Like it will destroy you. And so you're right, that if we have something that has absolutely no entertainment value in it whatsoever, you're just looking at something that is, effectively like let's imagine like your movie is a pre-recorded philosophy lecture. Right? It's like, well, that's a terrible movie. That could be something else that's not bad. But that is you're really just wasting the whole form here. And so I think that that's true, right? We see that you can take something to there's sort of an Aristotelian golden mean here. Now, also within that, if we take your example of entertainment as sugar or fat, if I cooked you a dish that was just a plate full of lard, it would be kind of gross. It'd be a little disgusting. Not only from the perspective of unappetizing, but also, I mean, how many plateful of lards can you eat? That came out wrong. How many plates of lard can you eat before you have a heart attack? To be perfectly honest, that we see that in excess in any of these, there's this sort of like, there's this kind of gross excess to it. Now, I would assert that if we look at cinema taken over the last, I don't know, let's just say 90 years, it's been an art form, or especially in the last 20 years, the problem is not that we aren't trying hard enough to be entertaining or palatable, right? That does not seem to be the excess I note. If anything, we see this kind of like groveling pandering, like, oh, we've got to be, like I said, with music, kind of maximally acceptable to all people. It'll be kind of a theme park ride of a movie, where you put your hands up and scream, oh, there's the monster, and it's PG-13, so the kids can watch too. While I accept your point conceptually, I don't think that is something we are dealing with in our day-to-day lives, right? Although I would also argue most modern movies are absolute trash, and again, like that plate of lard, have become unfun and unentertaining. Maybe because they're almost trying too hard.
I just wanted to check in that our cadence is about 20 minutes per round rather than 10 minutes per round. So
sorry. Yeah.
we can end up
speed up
talking for 2 hours. I mean, I'm fine. I just wanted to warn you that at our current rate, we will end up talking for 2 hours, which is more than I had promised you. So
oh yeah, sure. I'm fine. I've sometime today I've got to go help a
it's not gonna
do some work, but it won't be hard.
It's not going to be more than 2 hours. We'll see where we end up. But let's give you a score for that round. I'm going to give you, because I think that was an exceptional discussion, 14.
Oh, thank you very much.
But I do apologize for the cheapening of a discussion by giving it a score. Something it's a whole dynamic that I'm wrestling with.
Look, I think you should be even more arbitrary and pre-select the scores you're going to get before the discussion even happens. Just
assuming that's not what I've done. All right, round 4: psychology, elite theory, or theology.
I'll go with psychology.
Mental health issues must be destigmatized. Social media is psychologically harmful, or consciousness can never be replicated by artificial intelligence.
So I will take mental health issues must be destigmatized. And to be a really annoying guest, both argue against what is asserted and the core premise. I don't believe in mental health, and I don't think it should be destigmatized.
Wow, a double attack on this.
I also, on a third point, I don't even think it's possible to destigmatize something, so I will just disagree with every single word in that sentence.
Yeah, I don't think it's a mental issue. I think it shouldn't be called health. It's not an issue, and it should be re-stigmatized.
And I don't think you could destigmatize it even if you tried. Yeah. Taking that seriously, right? Mental health issues must be destigmatized. So at the broadest level, we have this idea of destigmatizing. So this again is a very liberal idea. And it is the idea that there is really no definitive difference between any two things. What really matters is the social reaction to those things, right? It is all a social construction. You can monkey around with basically any social interaction whatsoever. And so long as you kind of like weight the scales so things are equally prestigious, you'll be able to engineer results. That's not how the world works, right? The idea of destigmatizing something to make it good is very clearly not the case. So let's look at the sexual revolution, right? We have successfully, on a cultural level, destigmatized abortion. We've destigmatized butt marriage. We've destigmatized, transgenderism. And on any level, does that make it right? No, clearly not. Something being popular does not make it right. This is actually, weirdly enough, sort of been the theme of our last two discussions, right? Popularity does not, imbue something with moral worth. But also, if we're looking at a more utilitarian sense, right? If we were, the premise placed before us is always, trans teens are killing themselves because of stigma, because they feel embarrassed, or gay teens are killing themselves. You remember this in the mid 2000s, right, with the "It Gets Better" campaign, which was premised exactly on this. The idea is, gay young people are disproportionately likely to harm themselves. We will create this whole campaign with famous gay people saying, it gets better. You can be a good gay. Destigmatizing it, right? And if that works, right, we should see those subcultures living more healthy lives, even aside from our moral objections. And that is not the case, right? The 41% figure you hear thrown around the trans community, that's certainly very worrying. The suicide rate for gay men is significantly higher. The amount of self-harm, the amount of drug abuse, the amount of extreme promiscuity is incredibly high and has not meaningfully been changed. So to me, this idea of destigmatizing something is completely and totally fallacious. I don't even really believe it's a real argument. I believe it is effectively an argument to destroy existing social organizations and replace it with this kind of like gray goo of everything is basically the same. All right, so let's go back to mental health issues and being destigmatized. So I will take sort of the similar tact, right, which is essentially creating a situation in which it's okay to be schizophrenic. It's okay to be, depressed or anxious is the most common one. Do we see a reduction in those symptoms? Very clearly not. We don't. What we see is that effectively everyone gets brought down to the level of these sort of like hyper anxious agoraphobes. I've said before, my wife is a teacher, and there's an excellent article by Librarian of Salerno, who's a Substacker, and it's called something like "How to Stop Shooting Each Other." And it's about, dysfunctional American inner city schools. But what it's really about is trauma-based teaching, which is this idea that everything is a mental health issue, everything must be destigmatized. And Librarian of Salerno is writing about it in the context of a violent inner city school, where it is sort of absurd to ask a young gangbanger, well, how does that make you feel after he's shot up a store, right? It's stupid. Now, my wife is in a very different situation. She teaches at a suburban elementary school in a very good area. But nonetheless, you see that same focus on trauma and mental health. And what she said is someone who's young, sort of remembers their time in school, is like, what the heck? Like, there are so many kids with, anxiety disorders, with mental health issues. And she's like, this wasn't the case when I was in school. I wasn't that long ago. She's worked at other schools where this is not practice. It's not the case. So again, we see that by the objective standards, the results are getting worse. This is sort of my big problem with mental health as an industry, right, with psychotherapy, is that this has been around for roughly 100 years in some form or another. And the promise, much like destigmatization, is, we'll do this and everyone will be better off. And that is the exact opposite of what we've seen. It seems like these things are correlated with the rise of mental issues. It's sort of like, appointing, a town ghost hunter and paying him by the ghost. And all of a sudden you'll discover that there are ghosts everywhere that only he can see. And you have the same thing, right? Where you have dozens of therapists, inserted into every government institution. This is another level of it as well, which is a patronage network. that all of a sudden, you're magically discovering more and more kids with mental issues. So let's also look at that idea of mental health, right? We'll attack every line in this sentence. I don't really believe in mental health, largely for the same reason I've said about psychotherapy, right? Which is, since this concept has been introduced, people are not doing better. So what I'm not trying to say is schizophrenia doesn't exist, right? I'm not trying to say that someone can't be unwell, mentally, right?
Yeah.
People have nervous breakdowns. But this concept of mental health is not an objective category, right? That is an ideological tool. And what it basically means is, you have an issue that requires you to go to therapy, which is basically therapy is, and I take E. Michael Jones or Ernst Jünger, different thinkers, but they kind of came to the same thing, which is that therapy is sort of this inversion of traditional Christian doctrine, specifically like the kind of idea of confession. And so what you're doing is you're talking to someone, you're confessing what you've done. And that person is not telling you, oh, you have done something wrong. They're not telling you like, oh, you need to repent for your sins. What they're telling you is, oh, there is this outside force making you sin. You have this disorder. You in the case of Freud, right? Like you had either childhood sexual trauma or this, relationship with your father. So it's really not your fault that this is wrong or this is needs to be addressed. And also within that concept of destigmatization, right? It's like, oh, the problem isn't that you did something wrong. The problem is that you feel that you did something wrong. And so within that, we see that twisting of virtue. And again, like throw out all of my moral arguments and just look at the raw numbers. Are people happier? No. Are people killing themselves more? Yes. And so to me, certainly some of this is environmental, which is also why that concept of mental health, I think, is a little bit dumb, because it's like, well, are you depressed because you have depression, right? This force, this sort of like demon attached to your soul. Or are you depressed because you look at a screen 8 hours a day, never go outside, and like to pleasure yourself to internet pornography, right? It's like, well, I mean, let's take the low-hanging fruit before we go diagnosing with you as a depressive. We're giving you this sort of disease. And so I think that I realize we need to speed things up, but I think that's my take on mental health issues must be destigmatized, an objection to every premise contained in that argument.
It was a blistering attack on the assertion that I gave you. I agree with a lot of what you said. There's one thing that is a pattern of thinking that I wanted to kind of question or dig into, which is a very natural kind of evidence pattern to spot and draw conclusions from, and I think it's valid. The kind of observation is valid, which is we've seen an increase in a certain type of psychological framework being used and applied, and we've also seen people, in any way you want to measure it, are becoming less balanced. They're becoming more depressed, more anxious, more suicidal. All of the types of personality disorder seem to be increasing. So the claim that this new therapeutic model is helping seems suspect. So the only query I want to raise to that line of thinking is, what if the forces that are unbalancing people and unbalancing society are accelerating so fast that actually the therapeutic stuff is necessary and is helping? It's just not enough to keep pace. So it's like somebody whose health is deteriorating quickly. If you look at society, right, we're sort of terminal, and we've got these various increasingly alarmist remedies being tried. None of them are going to work, but they might be a balm in the meantime. That is to say, we didn't used to see people with so many mental health issues, and now we do. But that could be genuine. We might be measuring something real that's happening, rather than causing it. How do we tease apart the fact that people's lives are falling apart from all of the other potential causes of that?
For sure. I understand your point. What I would say to that is, that would be a fully fair argument if we were talking about, I don't know, something like, people's mental health is worsening at the exact same rate that ice cream has been available in stores, right? Like, as ice cream has gotten more available, there's an example of this in statistics, which goes about ice cream consuming murders, right? Which is that those graphs tend to match up, right, month to month. But the problem is those are completely unrelated, right? Those are two things from different categories of life, and if they have an effect, it is an indirect one. And if we are looking at a triage list, right, it's like, well, we're probably going to start at the most proximate cause and work our way out. And maybe after we've solved 35 problems, we can get to the ice cream issue, right? The ice cream question, if you will. But when we look at something that the express purpose of a field is to do X, right? Like they have set themselves up with this core premise that we will make people's mental health outcomes better. And they're not doing that. In fact, they're doing the literal exact opposite. It's reasonable to look at that and say, like, well, what the hell? Like, this is the whole point you exist. And you have, far from making things better, made things manifestly worse.
Well, okay, but if you set up a bunch of little field hospitals in the Somme or in Verdun, and then you notice, like, these hospitals are supposed to be taking care of people's physical health, but as far as I can see, over the last few months, we've seen a drastic increase in the amount of people whose legs have been blown off. So I think the field hospitals should be our first port of
true,
call.
but we don't have doctors running around looking for people to blow their legs off to bring them back to their clinic and fix them, right? In the same way we do with mental health professionals, right? Sort of worming their way into every institution to try and find people to turn into clients. And so I certainly understand your point. And I'm not saying that every measurable, decrease in mental well-being is because of psychotherapy, right? But what I am saying is that, by any objective standard, they are failing to meet that challenge. And when we look at, a more traditional society, one in which people had bonds to one another, there were certainly massive shocks to that system, right? There were certainly times of war, times of famine, and definitely people cracked. You can read about, artists who had nervous breakdowns or kings who were insane. That's always happened. I maintain that, and one, it's actually quite important that there is stigma associated with that, right? You don't want to look at the mad king and say, well, I think maybe I should cut my ear off too. Like that,
right.
Seems like
not only has the stigma been reduced, we've actually, if anything, valorized people who are the most crazy.
But we have an alternative organization for dealing with what these people would describe as trauma, right? You have family, you have friends, you have a religious community, you have a network of people around you who are not like your therapist, right? Which is a stranger you see once a week, who you don't know anything about their life. You are not in the same social circle, and you are giving them a very tailored view of what's going on in your life, right? You are presenting your perspective. Whereas, if this is the guy who lives next door, and you're complaining about like, oh, my wife is so awful to me, but he knows your wife. He knows what's going on here. He's not going to tell you like, oh, you need to leave her. She's awful. She's a dead weight around your neck, because there's more context associated with that. You can't create yourself as this kind of like, perfect martyr. And then don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean people don't give bad advice. That doesn't mean that people didn't royally screw their life up in a previous existing order. But the idea that, no one had any ability to deal with problems before the invention of psychotherapy and mental health, it's flagrantly not true. This is if anything, it's sort of, much like, social media is to having real friends. It's sort of a simulacra of, really dealing with the problems in your life on a more organic level.
Well, you have totally torn apart that assertion. You were like a wild animal, uncaged, disemboweling it, and I'm going to give you 15 points for that round. And that brings us to round 5. Technology, natural sciences, or Christology?
You know what? I've been doing lots of topics that I don't normally talk about. So we'll do natural sciences as a firm non-science understander.
All right, let's see. A unified theory of physics is the ultimate goal of science. evolution is the origin of species, or material science is the source of most innovation?
Yeah, I'm going to be honest, Luke. I think I made a really bad decision because I have absolutely
I
nothing
can-
to say on any of those topics.
I
My
can
bad.
roll it back if you like.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I realized I got it over my head. I was like, I had no opinions to offer on any of those.
It will just take me a second because I'm going to have to manually edit the JSON
Oh, I'm
file
sorry. My bad.
that is the data backing my. No, it's my fault for building such a shaky. Oh no! Look what I've done now.
Oh, I just broke it. Sorry.
I'll tell you what. Do you remember while I'm fiddling with this? Do you remember the other categories that you had?
It was
Christology,
natural sciences, and yeah. Sorry, I got 2 out of 3.
I found why the problem. Refresh.
I mean, when you think about it, I didn't break it. I'm just helping you make this better.
You're certainly helping me understand it. Let's see if I refresh that and then next round. There we go. Technology was the other one.
Awesome. I'll take technology. Why not?
AI poses a greater threat than nuclear weapons. Silicon Valley is a transhumanist cult, or people will always choose convenience over privacy.
I'll take the third option. People always choose convenience over privacy.
And which side are you going to be arguing?
I'm going to argue in the affirmative on that one. This is going to be a less complicated argument than my normal ones. This is effectively just a pattern we see in human behavior. Is that taken at scale, humans will sort of adopt the path of least resistance. You know, if you've ever gone to university or something, or a place where they have footpaths, you'll notice this, right? You know, at the center of my university was a large field, right? It used to be a military school. It's called the drill field. And there were paths all around it where you were supposed to walk.
Mm-hmm.
And what effectively happened is that people cut through, right? They took the most optimal path, the one of least resistance, to get to their classes on time.
The desire path. Is that what it's called?
Exactly. And then what you see is, well, the administration's like, oh, that looks bad. So we'll make our own paths across the drill field, you know, so they don't tear up the grass. Well, those also didn't work, right? And so what you see is this cat and mouse game of directing traffic, right? Human traffic around so that it doesn't, you know, knock up the landscaping, and also so people can kind of get to where they want to go. And what you see is that almost no solution satisfies the mob. Right, the mob wants to get where it's going. You know, they want to get to class on time, and so they just go for the easiest thing. And so you see the same thing with convenience over privacy, right? There's sort of a minority of mildly autistic men on the internet, Luke, that I think you and I are both among, who are worried about privacy. But to be honest, if you talk to the normal person, they see no problem with having their location turned on at all times. You know, sending the data, you know, on their TikTok viewing history to the CCP, you know, let alone, you know, the sort of, you know, their internet traffic, what they consume as far as, you know,
if you ask them a specific question about a hypothetical privacy concern, they'll claim to be very concerned, but the revealed preference is that they couldn't care less.
Well, exactly. And so that's my argument very much, which is revealed preference. You know, like people can say whatever they want, but you know, if people actually cared about privacy, we would be in a very different situation with consumer technology, because there are options. You know, they just are more inconvenient. They require some more work. And what do we see? You know, there's a small percentage that does it, but I mean, you can't even get most people to tape over their web camera. You know, like because that is like moderately inconvenient. So to me, this is sort of and I don't attach any moral weight to this. I don't think that this is good or bad, really, but it's people don't care. You know, they have shown that they don't care.
I guess privacy is in some ways an exercise in risk assessment, because, well, is that fair? Maybe I should pose this as a question. Like, is there some obligation for a righteous man to protect his privacy? What is the reason? Is it a preference, or is there an actual ethical issue here? Like, being a private person, is that a choice, or is that a good or a bad thing, I guess?
I mean, I would say that is a good thing. You know, we have to understand that none of this data is used for benign purposes, right? It's effectively these like godless transhumanist, like globalist types who just like kind of get off on knowing everything about you. So I think that one, stymieing those people is a noble goal, right? Not letting them do that is a good thing.
But a lot of the time, the data is not used at all, I would imagine. Like you mentioned, people ought to tape over their webcam, but most webcams, most of the time, are not recording any information that's useful to anybody. There's a small risk of the webcam intruding into your privacy and being used against you in some way. And that's why I was mentioning it being a risk assessment issue, because in some ways the convenience is of genuine immediate value. People will save time in their lives, time that they can apply to doing other good things. You could make an actual positive case for why the convenience is important. The privacy, you can end up being a bit of a conspiracy nut. Maybe that's a derogatory phrase towards people who are unfairly maligned, but I guess what I'm saying is you can become paranoid about a risk that is not real. You know, most of us are not, we're not being faced with state actors trying to, we aren't Angela Merkel, where the CIA is going to try and hack her phone for some really important geopolitical reason. There's just no threat. So actually, I guess I'm arguing it's completely reasonable assessment for a lot of people to choose convenience over privacy in many cases.
So sure, and I think your point about conspiracy is generally correct, but also when we look at something like advertising, right? It's kind of been proven time again that Google actually is listening to your microphone, right? You can install a new browser, talk about dog toys for half an hour, and magically, you'll start getting ads for dog toys, right? Something like that. There's sort of experiments to back this up. So that's one, and that's advertising, right? Which is advertising as sinister as what could be happening, right? Someone stealing your credit card, or someone trying to get a picture of you in a compromising position to extort money from you. I mean, no, but it's also kind of weird and gross. You're sort of being engineered into wanting certain products, engineered to being placed in front of certain products that you may be kind of vulnerable to. So I think that's bad. I think that advertising generally is negative, and playing into that game by giving them kind of what you're thinking about at any one time is probably not particularly positive. I mean, I will also say, I think that in the scope of ethical issues we have talked about, this is pretty low on the list in the grand scheme of things, right? Like, I don't consider it to be a grand moral indictment of yourself that that you don't use a privacy browser. But at the same time, it's sort of like you were giving ammunition to a group of people who very clearly do not have your best interest in mind. And so it's sort of a prudential thing, even if it's not necessarily a moral one. Again, I'm not a huge tech guy, so
no. There's an interesting angle to this, which I sometimes think about, that if you're using like a Tor browser and a VPN, and you're jumping through hoops to do everything secretively, in some ways you're kind of engineering your life to be in the dark. And I'm thinking of the first chapter of First John, partly here, and indeed the first chapter of the Gospel of John, that talk about how like people who live in the dark do so because their deeds are dark and that they don't want to be discovered. And actually, it's kind of connected also to the question of anonymity. I've partly chosen to be myself. I'm visible on the camera and I have my real name attached to my content across all platforms, because I actually think that drives me to behave better, because I have like a form of scrutiny on me that is positive. I'm less likely to flame someone out on Twitter because I know that the people I know in my real life know my Twitter account, and I actually think that's a positive decision. Takes some courage in some ways, but that's almost a lack of privacy that I'm opting for, to say I'm going to choose to be less private, because the privacy in some cases is something that people choose for bad reasons.
I understand your point. I think that, privacy is certainly something that is abused, but I think we also have to understand the relative context we're dealing with. I'm going to reference Junger again, because one of the things he talks about is that, once you had the invention of electricity and a telephone line, and a mailbox, even, you were much less private than you were in the pre-existing world, right? Where back then it was like, well, you were in your house, there's nothing connected to your house, right?
Yes.
So if
you can't wiretap an internal room,
right? But even that, it's like, well, I mean, you don't have to pay a bill, you just have a house, right? And all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, now you're paying a utility bill, so you get some benefit to that, but also someone else has a say in a way that they didn't before. Like, you have to pay that person. Now you can get a telegraph to your house, which is much less intrusive than having, an internet browser. But still, it's like, well, you're not really in your own house anymore, right? You're in a place where you can be reached at all moments. And so, when we look at the relative amount of privacy, right, that our ancestors would have had, even, Junger died in the 90s, right? He was 100 years old, plus or minus, when he died. So this is the turn of the 19th century, right? When he's talking about at the earliest, let's say the early 20th. And effectively, right, we see a radically increased amount of privacy. Now, also comes with that a lack of access to information. You don't have the internet at your fingertips. But nonetheless, right, we see that people were able to be, from a certain perspective, much more private, right? No one knew what you were talking about in the confines of your home. No one knew what you were thinking about. Now, don't get me wrong, there is a long tradition of anonymity, right? Nietzsche wrote anonymously, the American founders wrote anonymously. This was relatively normal for the same reasons that, many anons are currently anonymous. But also we see from another perspective, a higher amount of accountability, right? So one of the things that's interesting about in pre-existing order is almost every society would have, prostitutes, right? They have a cat house on the outskirts of town. That was sort of a managed part of society. But let's look at that, right? Like, okay, that's always an option to you, but well, how do you get there? Walk? Like if you're an upstanding member of society, now you're doing something shady, right? They don't know exactly what you did, but I mean, that's your face. If someone sees you going in or going out, you could suffer damage. So while I certainly understand your point about the misuse of anonymity, the misuse of privacy, and the idea of like constantly trying to hide, but there's a difference in, basically not letting the people around you, know what you're reading or know what you're doing. Like normal things, right? Like, hey, what are you looking at? Slam your browser closed. That's a little suspicious. And then, hey, there's this kind of like godless, atheist in a data center in I don't know, Silicon Valley, compiling data. I think those are very different things. And while certainly there's a discussion to be had about privacy, and maybe we sort of drifted from the core premise, because I think that in this, most people always can choose convenience. You see this in the boomer conservatives, right? Who are saying the most insane stuff about like murdering Joe Biden from first name, last name, their address on their Facebook account, and you're like, okay, well, that's a little unhinged, and you see in that people do, even though that's something that is likely to get them in trouble. They're still saying that from their, their convenient personal Facebook account. So point is, I think that as far as that assertion, people will always choose convenience over privacy. I do understand the point you've made about privacy. I think that if we view that within a larger context, it's sort of, I don't know, there's a deeper discussion there. The kind of concessions we make to the eyes of others would be kind of monstrous to those in a pre-existing order. But nonetheless, I do understand that, you can take it too far and sort of revel in your anonymity in a way that I don't think is positive.
Great. Well, I'm going to give you 12 for that round because I thought you knocked it down again in very short order, and that brings us to our final round: literature, software and mathematics, or eschatology.
Oh, I'm gonna swing for the fences with literature.
All right. Literature. Censorship of literature is dangerous. Translation is impossible. Or TV adaptations cannot capture the depth of the original text.
I will take adaptations cannot capture the depth of the original text. So actually, I got into a little bit of trouble on Twitter because I quite liked the second Dune movie. I thought it was very good. Now, I'll go on a brief aside about that. Part of that is that the message that Denis Villeneuve is trying to tell you is not the message the movie effectively tells you, right? He's trying to say Paul has become this monster. How could he abandon Chani and go to conquer the stars? But the real message is disregard women, acquire empire, conquer the world, punish your enemies. And I'm like, hell yeah, that's awesome. Not the message the movie's trying to tell you, right? But
which is much, if you're somebody who's read the book first, you're tuned to notice the delta, the difference.
Right, certainly. And within that, I was talking to a friend of mine on Telegram, and he was like, yeah, but it wasn't a very good Dune movie. That's fair. It's basically a Dune flavored movie about transcending your humanity, right? I fully accept that. But the reason that doesn't really insult me in any given way is that I don't really believe in the concept of adaptation per se. Right? When you change a medium, you fundamentally change the artwork, right? Marshall McLuhan has this idea that the medium is the message, that within any form, it sort of affects what you are getting from any piece, right? So people could kind of straw man my argument and say, does that mean that you can't make a book into a movie? No, not at all. That's not what I'm saying. But it becomes fundamentally transformed by that. So for instance, right, let's take The Passion of the Christ. The Passion of the Christ has a lot of core similarities with the Gospels, right? It's the same story, but it's a fundamentally different experience. Don't get me wrong, I quite like the Gospels, but I don't squirm reading the Gospels in the way you do, watching the kind of climax of A Passion of the Christ, right? Where he's being beaten. It's a different experience. And to say it wasn't, we skipped all these verses, you're sort of missing the point. Right? The point is not to be a one-to-one of something. Because again, within a different media, you have different constraints. You can't really have a movie where someone, like you would in reading a book, reads it for a little bit or reads it verse by verse, puts it down, comes back to it later. Right? That's not really possible in the same way. Similarly, television, I don't watch much television, but television is probably closer to movies than any other media, but it's still fundamentally different, right? You're dealing with an episodic format. It's serialized in many cases. And then also, it's what's your total runtime? Let's just say on the short side, maybe 12 hours, 12 to 24 hours for a season of television. Oh, well, that's a whole lot more ground to cover than, even a very, very long 3-hour movie. And so within that, you just have different constraints. And so I guess I agree with the idea that you can't capture the depth of the original text because you don't have the time to go through it. That in shortening something, and you do have to shorten something, you lose some of the depth. That length, that extra text length, is not just there, to describe scenery, right? It's not there to be something you can kind of cut to the chase with in visual media. You can say if it took them 4 pages to describe a scene, I can just show them the scene, right? We can pick up some distance there. But, there's a reason that even an audiobook of a relatively short book might take you 4 or 5 hours to listen to. But again, because there is simply more information there, it's not designed to be taken in one sitting. And so I think that, just because you're dealing with different media, you're going to be getting something different. Now, different does not mean worse, right? I've mentioned Stalker before, and Stalker is an adaptation of a novella. It is also a video game. And while I've never played the video game, I've been told it's quite good. And there's certainly a similar premise, right? There are similar ideas in it. But is it an adaptation? I mean, not really, right? The characters are different. There's different questions being asked. And both of those things are quite good. I really like A Roadside Picnic, and I really like the Tarkovsky film. But to nitpick one is saying, well, it's not a true reflection of the other. I think you're impoverishing yourself, right? You are giving yourself a bad hand of cards and forcing yourself to play it, where it's like, something can be vaguely connected, right? Like I mentioned, I like Dune 2. I like the book Dune, but they're not the same thing. And I like Dune 2 more as this is interesting, right? This is a good film visually. It presents an interesting question. There's the other level, which is the kind of postmodern level of this movie is trying to tell me something that isn't true and failing at it, which is also another level of interesting. And it's like, well, is that the same thing as Frank Herbert's book? No, but just saying, well, it's bad because it's not, to me, it's like, well, maybe you could certainly make a more faithful adaptation, but even the most faithful adaptation is not the same thing. When you talk about adaptations, people's gold standard is the Lord of the Rings movies, right? Particularly the director's cuts. And I think those are quite good adaptations. But if you talk to a true, Tolkien autist, they'll tell you any number of things, Tom Bombadil, for example, that are quite fundamental to the plot of the book.
Scouring of the Shire.
Exactly, that are gone. And so again, what do you say with that? Oh, this is a bad movie because it is not what conceptually could be, or do you look at it sort of as something in and of itself? And you are adapting something from one media, from one dimension to another. And fundamentally, you are going to have to add, change, make it fit. Because like we said about, art movies earlier, it's like, well, if you made, an hour and a half long psychology lecture and released it as a feature film, it would be, certainly it could be the best psychology or, philosophy lecture ever, but it would be a horrible movie. Likewise, if your movie was a 41-hour audiobook of Lord of the Rings, that would be an awful movie, right? That would be terrible. Just sitting there, reading the book on a silver screen in a mall for 2 days. That wouldn't be particularly pleasant. And let alone you'd sort of be missing the best parts of it. And so to me, I think that a lot of the discussion about adaptation, it sort of annoys me because you see people who are sort of, I'll use the derogatory term, fanboys of a certain property, of a certain book, and they get so mad that their favorite X, Y, or Z, the thing that they love, this book, isn't exactly how it is. And it's like, well, again, look, a lot of adaptations are horrible trash, but generally they're horrible trash for any number of other reasons than the fact that they're not perfect one-to-one copies of the original. Because if you are making a perfect one-to-one copy, why remake it? This is my point with Disney and re-releasing, with new visuals, their old animated classics, right? All they do is they make the same movie, but put a new coat of paint on it. It's like, well, this is pointless, right? This is a repackaging of the same product. I still have Snow White on VHS. I don't need to go to the theater and watch one, with horrible progressive actors who hate me and kind of uncanny valleys, CGI. It's like I have the original and it's good. But if it's something like Lord of the Rings and it's like, I love this. This is great. I want to see a visual version of this. Then I have that. That is a differentiated product. And by being differentiated, it must be different. So anyway, sorry, that's my rant on adaptation and media analysis.
No, there's a lot there that you said extremely well and is important. I was thinking that as an artist, if you're a filmmaker and you choose to make a film, it is perfectly valid to use a pre-existing work in the same or a different medium, and you, depending on what you're trying to achieve, you may make the connection extremely tight, or you may have a loose sense of inspiration. And I really deeply do not think that there is a right or wrong. You can't just, you can't just say it ought to be as close as possible or it ought to be extremely different. Those are far too broad and sweeping statements. You have to, as a creator, as a creative, you're entering into making something, and a lot of the artistic decisions you're going to make are going to have to be sort of instinctive, intuitive. You have to make them in a way in advance of the production, and you can't entirely know how successful your decisions are going to be. And then you have a different group of people out the other end of the process who are reviewing what's been produced. And sometimes what's created is a success, and sometimes what's been created is not a success. And you can sometimes argue that the person making the creative decisions at the start of the process should have known better, that actually they made this decision for a bad reason, and you can blame them. But I also think quite often that the success or failure of a creative project can be slightly in, it's there's an element of luck involved, where you bring together a team and you hope that all the people that you've chosen to participate are going to be firing on all cylinders, and that's based on aspects of their individual lives. So the triumphant success of something like the Lord of the Rings movies partly comes down to just the happenstance that the people who were involved they gelled and they had the similar vision, and at the same time the director gets some credit for decisions that were made, and the writing team had a certain, to what I'm saying is, to some degree it could be blameworthy. Clearly there are movies that become bad because the person is pushing an ideological perspective that is evil, and so you're watching the thing being like, well, I don't like this because of the messaging, and the messaging is deliberate. But a lot of the time it's more along the lines of, this isn't working artistically, and I think in retrospect, doing what's the expression, Monday night quarterbacking,
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Monday night quarterbacking, I think.
I don't know why it's called Monday. Is it because they play the game on Sunday? Is that the...
Yes, they also. It's confusing because I think it is Monday morning, because they both play games on Sunday and the special one on Monday night. But if you were a Monday night quarterback, you would just be playing in the game. This is not an important digression whatsoever. I also don't
it's
really
just
understand
a little bit
football.
A little bit of kind of American culture that has passed me by. Anyway, my point is that you can look at a movie after the fact and identify what broke it. But that's very different from saying that had you been there at the time, you could have identified the problem as it was happening. It's much easier to look at a film after it's come out, or I guess in this, we're meant to be talking about TV adaptations. So, so you take they're going to make a TV adaptation of Harry Potter, as I understand. So if you were tasked with making that TV adaptation, I think you can try as hard as you like to make it the best set of TV shows you can, which will require you to choose how close you are to the original source material, the books. And after it comes out, you will be able to you'll be able to step back and say, either I made that decision correctly, or I should have been closer to the books, or I should have deviated further from the books. But in some ways, the challenge of being a creative person is that you have to take the responsibility for that decision in advance, not knowing if the decision is correct or not, and then you just hope that your experience that you've accumulated over your life means that decision is more likely to be the right one.
So this is an interesting piece of Burden lore, but I have
Ooh.
only seen the Harry Potter movies exactly one time. I've
One
never
each.
read the books. It was just my
Okay.
wife and I, when we were dating, she was like, "Wait, you've never seen these?" And I was like, "I mean, no, I just never came up." And so sat down, watched all of them. That was several years ago. Had no contact with the property before or since. And so anytime these come out, I'm like, I think I remember. There's a guy running around. He had some hair. I don't know. I have very limited memories and very limited understanding of Harry Potter because watching those as an adult, like they're good. Like I
Right.
enjoyed them. I can see why a young kid would get into them. But it's
Yeah.
sort of just this like complete cultural diversion that I just never interacted with. And so like I think especially for people slightly older than me who are very
Yeah.
emotionally attached to Harry Potter, I remember when that was going on, but for whatever reason, I just never touched it. Which is, of course, a complete aside. But I think that your point is largely correct. I think that in general, what matters most with adaptation is execution. If it's good, it's good. Like it doesn't really within certain bounds, or it doesn't really matter how you get there. And so if your version of a good movie is and you see these from time to time, right? These adaptations that have absolutely nothing to do with the original source material. I'm trying to think. There have been a number of cases of this. There was some. It was schlock. I cannot remember the name of it. It was like Jupiter or something. There was some kind of like sci-fi property that recently came out, and it was revealed that was an adaptation of something else that got scuppered at the last minute. So they had 80% of a movie, and they're like, I don't know, look for some franchise, throw it on the box, and ship it. Now, that was trash, right, for any number of reasons. But there are cases in which, Blade Runner is a great example, right? The Android's Dream of Electric Sheep. It's like, it's not a particularly great adaptation by the book. It's an amazing movie. The Rutger Hauer line at the end wasn't even the original script. It was improvised. He came up with that, wrote it on the way to the set. And so it's like, well, does that matter? I mean, from a certain perspective, if we are having a discussion about what is the most accurate adaptation, we could say, yes, this is a bad adaptation by that standard. But, if we're fundamentally interested in the question of art, what is good, what is bad, that is an almost completely irrelevant conversation. Yeah, again, like it could be an interesting anecdote, but, we're interested in quality here. And so, I think that your point about like Monday morning quarterbacking and kind of turning everything into critique, it's of limited utility. I think that this is one of the things you see, and this is most definitely a conversation for another time, but I will say it, in kind of millennial progressives, is this idea that, their taste in media, their opinion on, properties or media made them smart and important, and it was something that sort of conveyed worth to them. And don't get me wrong, we talked about taste. I think that's important. If you consider yourself to be like a refined person, someone who is interested in cultivating, your higher instincts. But like the idea that, like liking the right movies conveys moral worth, I think is a limited one. And you see that very much in like that Monday morning quarterback media analysis culture, which I find incredibly irritating.
It's just, if Blade Runner, the film, had not been an artistic triumph, then it would be very easy to pick it apart by saying you had a really good story to adapt. Why did you differ from it? You would have had a success, as it were, playing it safe by just adapting as closely as possible. In fact, it comes out and it is a cinematic masterpiece. Specifically, it's doing various things really innovatively within the scope of cinema. And because it pushed boundaries forwards in a new medium, it's remembered extremely well. But in order to reach the heights that it did, it had to take the risk of deviating from the source material. And when somebody tries by adapting in a more imaginative way and it fails, I just think the discourse should be a little bit more generous to the creators in saying, I don't like what you produced, but I also, well, I think I just the attitude of review culture, where you go to watch something and then if you don't like it, you tear it apart mercilessly. I always feel maybe I'm overly soft here, but I feel bad for all the people who worked so hard to create a thing that turned out not to be a success. But there's something in the attitude of a reviewer where I think you ought to feel a sense of sadness about reporting bad news. You shouldn't sugarcoat your opinion. Like, I think it's important to be able to be honest, but I also think you should respect the amount of effort that goes into attempting to create something, and that when it fails, failure is the default for a creative project, and when it succeeds, that is because almost certainly because the artist and the artists involved have been through so many rounds of trying and failing. So I just think the implication a lot of times when somebody fails to create something that is an elevated work, the implication is that it's blameworthy. The person has some moral failing as an artist, and actually that's not necessarily true. Sometimes I think you have actual evidence for that, and then maybe you should have a little bit more bile, a vitriolic review at that point. But often it's that the people tried their best and they didn't succeed, and it's a sad situation. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do. And again, I think that it's media analysis culture is really irritating for that reason. It's like, what have you done? You've done nothing. Now, I think that there's also a difference, and I kind of carve out a difference between, there's kind of different categories of bad. And I actually enjoy low quality cinema quite a bit. I've joked that Blade is my favorite movie. I've watched a lot of bad movies and really enjoyed it. So there's kind of several categories there. There is like, well, this is bad because it's just poorly technically executed. That's not particularly interesting. Then there is the bad of like big Cloma Homo schlock, like whatever Aquaman movie just came out. That's not that interesting. But the two
sort
that
of
are
cynical,
the two that are genuinely fascinating to me are the like, this was a massive movie that was a disaster. How did this happen? So I remember when that movie, that live action Cats movie came out right before COVID.
Oh yeah,
I went to see it in the theaters. And I was just fascinated by it from a production perspective. Like, you got all of these famous people together, made this disaster, and we're like, I guess we still have to bring it out. And so I watched it in a very brief amount of time before it was released, and then it was taken down and re-edited and stuff. That's just kind of fascinating from like an anthropological perspective, right? The other one, and my favorite category, is the fully self-convinced but absolutely delusional artist, right? So there's a great
Tommy Wiseau.
Yeah, he's a good example. But my personal favorite is this movie called Miami Connection, right? It's this kind of 80s like ninja movie, and it's super over the top. It's kind of crazy. The script doesn't make a ton of sense. The dialogue is awful. It's about some guys, fighting drug dealers and or communists, right? But when you kind of learn it, that one of the main characters, and they're all supposed to be in college together, he's like this 50-year-old Korean guy, and like, he doesn't make sense. But then you learn the story of it, right? That this guy was a Korean immigrant. He started a successful series of dojos, got really rich in South Florida, and his dream in life was to be in a movie. So he got him and all his friends together, including the government of Florida, right? Like the district attorney of Miami is a major player in this movie. And they're like, yeah, we all like this guy. Let's be in his movie. And it's kind of cheesy. They play in a rock band together and fight ninjas. But like, it's kind of fun. Like, is it bad? Yes, but it's like, it's an interesting experience. You're kind of going into someone's mind, and it's like, okay, is that objectively bad? Yes, but that is really different than kind of endlessly griping about, new Globo Homo version of Star Wars. I don't like it. It's like, okay, guys, like you're not wrong, but like maybe there's a more productive use of your time. And if you enjoy bad movies, which I happen to, like there's more interesting things to talk about than just big product bad, big product bad. New Netflix woke. And you see that circuit, right? You know, there are people who kind of make their living, a very good living, you know, complaining about those things. And to me, I just don't know if that's entirely productive. It going back to our conversation about music, it sells well, but it's probably not good for your soul.
So I don't know if you're aware, one of the other projects I've got on my plate at the moment, as well as these conversations, is I'm working on a radio play that I'm doing as the most ambitious version of it that I can realistically manage. So it's going to be 90 minutes long with a full bespoke score and fully cast, with a bespoke script. It's going to be as high production and movie quality as a like one person doing it in a fraction of my spare time over a couple of months with some other random volunteers from the internet can do. But I wonder if, because I'm in the middle of that process and I'm very, very conscious of the fact that when it comes out, people will have strong negative opinions about it, no matter how hard I try or how genuinely good it is, in fact. But I think I'm very conscious at the moment of the fact that these projects are enormous undertakings that are done largely in the dark, and it's only after you've finished the whole thing and you emerge into the light of day and you discover what it is that you've actually been working on the whole time. And it is very easy for somebody to, from their armchair, like snipe at it, because there are 100,000 creative decisions, and any one of them people can easily hold up as the whole project was a failure because I didn't like X. And you know, it's the easiest thing in the world to pull apart, tear up an artistic creation. But to build something up from scratch, even something bad, does require a great effort of both time and imagination and coordination, and yet, but in, you know, you mentioned the review culture around the new Star Wars movies, which were pretty bad movies and deserved lots of the criticism. And I watched hours and hours and hours of that kind of content. I don't know if it was a smart decision to do so, but I do think in some ways I learned lessons from dissecting the mediocre offerings from Disney that hopefully will play into me producing something that is of more value, that does take itself a bit more seriously and, you know, aims for a higher end. So there is a sense in which the vicious criticism that I'm, you know, on the one hand, as somebody working on a creative project, I'm becoming sensitive to it and want to push it away. But on the other hand, I've greatly enjoyed that stuff in the past myself. And in some ways, it has formed me as a creator to study the failure of others that are torn apart in this really vicious way. And the fact that it was done so with such glee and abandon is partly why, hopefully, I've learnt the lessons and thought about these creative questions. So yes, I guess I'm ambivalent about the place of criticism in culture.
Well, I think that, you know, you're right. One of the other things about, you know, kind of criticism is that my sympathy is entirely dependent on how much of a progressive nutcase you are, right? If your movie is about, you know, like the brave, woman, humiliating men and, kind of upending the social order. It's like, I feel no sympathy whatsoever when people tell you your movie is trash because it's
Right.
trash, right? And I think that there's a
Yeah.
difference between that kind of politicized propaganda drivel and,
Yeah.
hey, you missed, like
Yeah.
you didn't hit this one out of the park. And I think that,
Yeah.
you see that in, like, because there are certainly movies that are not good, but almost no one cares about, right? The vast majority of movies really are not good. Again, it goes back to that idea of pyramid. But I think that, broadly speaking, there's certainly the advantage that it does kind of heighten the, you want to take something seriously when you feel like you could be, put up against significant criticism. But I think that honestly, a lot of this criticism is, to me, like, critics have always existed, but I think a large reason that online criticism has really exploded is one, the kind of like mainstreaming of nerd culture, right? Which is the idea that all of these like tiny franchises matter quite a bit and your opinions on them matter. What I said earlier about millennials kind of viewing themselves in relation to their taste in media consumption, is making them kind of like particularly valuable or interesting. But then also I think that the whole Gamergate angle, which is basically like, more and more media is incredibly politicized and people hate that and want to talk about how they hate that. Those are related but sort of different phenomena, right? Like there are dozens of videos right now talking about like, top 10 Mega Man bosses or something, right? Well, there's a certain element of criticism there, but there's a lot less heat on that than there is on like, the culture war stuff. And I think it is kind of a symptom of, people feeling not just like this is bad, but this is attacking me and is offensive to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so for viewers who want to catch my radio play when it is released, which will be as the culmination of Lambster this year. So, each of these episodes of the Gauntlet I'm releasing them one per day. And then on the final day will be the radio play. But it's not going to be on this channel. So in the description, there's a link to a new channel I've set up called Lambda Media. So go and subscribe to that if you want to see the radio play, and then leave me a review as a comment underneath. And I will leave it to your conscience how honest you want to be with me about how terrible it ends up being. But I think it's getting exciting. It's starting to look like it's actually going to be good. I'm going to give you 14 points for that round. Oh, my button isn't working. Oh, there we go. And that brings me to the high score table. I don't know why it's going so slow. There we go. I need to refresh it before you appear. Oh, look at that. You are tied at the top of the high score table. You're
at that.
You are a Gauntlet winner.
Well, I'll put it this way. I've never directly talked to Poe, but she better be careful because I'm a bad loser and I will take a technical win. So I guess that I technically just made a threat live on air to someone I've never met, but never mind. That was entirely a joke. It's purely coincidental. Right?
It's purely coincidental. Yes. Well, you're not the last guest, so you might not win the Gauntlet for the whole year, but you should bask in the temporary tie leadership that you have at the top of the table. And congratulations on your run of the Gauntlet. Very impressive.
Thank you very much, Luke. I appreciate it. This was a great conversation. I enjoyed it a lot.